Welcome in. We have a former U.S. Air Force fighter pilot that has been arrested by the FBI for allegedly providing the Chinese military defense services. We're going to take a look at what all that means and what we know about it. But first, I want to talk about just how egregious this is. And as a former fighter pilot, talk about the constructs of how this individual fit into the picture when it comes to a fighter squadron and training fighter pilots. Now, what we know thus far is the fact that Gerald Brown is a former F-35 Lightning II instructor. I'm going to talk about that, what I think that actually really means here in a minute. But with decades of experience flying military aircraft, allegedly betrayed his country by training Chinese pilots to fight against those he swore to protect. And that piece right there, not only did he betray his country, potentially, if this is true, but when it comes to fighter pilots, a lot of them move on to the airlines, move on to business. Pilots in general in the military move on to other things after their service commitment. However, there are many that stay and they actually teach at the bases. All these bases across the country, across the globe even, have simulator instructors. And a lot of those simulator instructors are retired Air Force pilots. Now, when we talk about the fighter community, they might have flown the F-4, the F-16, the F-15, and then as new planes come on board, they might not necessarily have flown that new plane, but they teach in the simulator. They get trained on that. They get read into all the programs, all the secrets. And then on a day-to-day basis, they're working with these fighter pilots who are flying the active line, the ones who are deploying, the ones who are out there defending. They have a personal relationship. Coming from my former base, we had 4 simulators at the base, 4 bays where you'd go run training scenarios, and you just had less than a dozen simulator instructors. So you knew each one of these guys. Now, typically they're not flying in the simulator. Those are the line pilots doing it as they get training, but they are running the console. They're providing feedback in the debrief. Again, they're an integral part, face-to-face, day-to-day. And that's why I think this makes it even more egregious, because you're selling not only your countrymen out, but the people that you're selling out when it comes down to this. There has been no indication of the amount of money that's involved. We saw a previous case that's still ongoing with a former United States Marine pilot that I believe is just a couple $100,000. While that is a lot of money, when it comes to selling your countrymen out and your fellow brethren out, it just doesn't seem like it's worth it to me. So let's take a look and see what we know out there. And first, we're going to go over to the Justice Department website and look at their press release. So first, former U.S. Air Force fighter pilot arrested for providing defense services to the Chinese military. Now, here's what we know thus far. Former U.S. Air Force fighter pilot Gerald Eddie Brown, his call sign is Runner. He's 65. He was arrested Wednesday in Jefferson, Indiana by the FBI, and he's charged with a criminal complaint for providing and conspiring to provide defense services to the Chinese military pilots without authorization in violation of the Arms Export Control Act. The United States Air Force trained Major Brown to be an elite fighter pilot and entrusted him with the defense of the nation. He now stands charged with training Chinese military pilots. So even though he is not exporting a piece of technology, he is exporting knowledge, vast knowledge that takes decades to build. Most likely, he entered the Air Force in his early 20s, like most fighter pilots do. So he's got 4 decades, more or less, of corporate knowledge that he's taken to the Chinese military. Again, allegedly. Gerald is a former F-35 II Lightning instructor with decades of experience flying the U.S. military aircraft. We'll look down below here a little bit at his actual flying career, what we know about it thus far. It does not look like he flew the F-35, so instructor pilot is probably a little loose term when it comes to this here, because most likely he was a simulator pilot that was training other pilots running that console. Nonetheless, he had a lot of knowledge and was read into a lot of secret programs for the F-35 and had access to a lot of these programs and knowledge that obviously adversaries would love to have that information. Undoubtedly, he most likely, with his 24 years of flying in the Air Force, was an instructor pilot in various other airframes. The Justice Department goes on to outline a little bit more about his career, saying he spent over 24 years in the Air Force, leaving active duty in 1996 with the rank of major. Now, that's kind of like Maverick from Top Gun. The math doesn't really math when it comes to the promotion system. However, there are some caveats there. Potentially, he was a prior enlisted airman in the military and racked up some service time before moving on. At 24 years time of service, you would expect him to be at least a lieutenant colonel, if not a colonel at this point. But he flew the F-4, the F-15, the F-16, and the A-10. Right, so no F-35 flying there. And he worked for 2 different contract simulator instructors with defense contracts. Again, as what I've alluded to before, teaching the A-10 and the F-35. So he was a simulator instructor. Again, he is read into all the things that are happening in those platforms, and he has a lot of access when it comes to that. Now, this all began in and around August of 2023 when Brown began arranging the terms to train Chinese military pilots using a co-conspirator to negotiate with Stephen Su Bin, who pled guilty in 2016 to conspiring to hack into computer networks of major U.S. defense contractors and steal sensitive military and export control data to the PRC. And he was ultimately sentenced to 4 years in prison for a bunch of that. So this is the guy he's working with to get him over there. The next part definitely doesn't make it any better if this is true. And so he's communicating with this co-conspirator. Brown has consistently stated his intent to train PRC military pilots in combat aircraft operation. In his resume he prepared on his application, he put his objective was an instructor fighter pilot. And his co-conspirator, the guy who's bringing this link together, told Brown that he hoped he would be assigned to my base. Otherwise, you'll go where it's a local equivalent of the United States Air Force weapons school. Later, he stated to the co-conspirator that upon his arrival in China, now I have the chance to fly and instruct fighter pilots again. So this is not getting any better as you read it. Again, if this is true, it's just absolutely heinous because he's selling his brothers and sisters out doing this. But he's excited to go teach fighter pilots again. That's what he's telling this co-conspirator. And the U.S. Air Force weapons school, that is the Air Force's equivalent of Top Gun. That's the easy thing for everyone to understand. But it's a 6-month course for most of our major weapon systems, from every fighter and bomber, even cargo and tanker aircraft. And the instructors that go to this school spend, again, 6 months grinding away. It's probably one of the most challenging schools out there, and they become the instructors' instructors. So that's where he is potentially going with this. And then in December, so shortly after he started arranging this, he arrives in China to begin working with PRC military pilots. He's questioned for about 3 hours about his U.S. Air Force experience, and that's on his first day. And then on his second day, he had prepared and presented a brief about himself for the People's Liberation Army Air Force. He remained in China until he traveled to the United States in early February 2026. So he spent, it seems, about like 2.5 years in China doing this work. Brown is not alone in this. There have been other pilots, specifically a former Marine Harrier pilot that was charged in 2017 and extradited to the United States, I believe in 2024, 2023, who's now awaiting trial for doing similar type things, training Chinese military pilots, starting off, I believe, in South Africa and then traveling to China as well. This has become such a problem and not just a singular case that the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, and other NATO countries have also issued warnings that the Chinese People's Liberation Army are going after former military pilots, trying to seduce them to come train their military. In February 2025, General James Hecker, who was then the commander of NATO, Allied Air Command, and U.S. Air Forces in Europe and Air Forces in Africa, stated, once you fly for our team, and even after you hang up your uniform, you have the responsibility to protect our tactics, techniques, and procedures. Again, seems pretty straightforward when it comes down to it. Undoubtedly, we'll see more information slowly start to trickle out about this. But again, the case against the former Marine fighter pilot who was alleged providing information to China and supporting Chinese military, that one is still ongoing. So this is going to be years in the making. I stand by this. This is a special kind of treason. Again, you worked intimately with the people you sold out on a day-to-day basis. It wasn't just taking information or hacking into a system. This person wrote grade sheets, taught, worked, lived, deployed with hundreds, if not thousands, of fellow pilots that he just gave away tactics, techniques, and procedures to weaken their defenses and capabilities. All right, with that being said, that's all I have for today. See you next time.